Today, I'm talking to Rory Stewart about Afghanistan, the situation on the ground there, and what he thinks needs doing to avert a humanitarian disaster. Rory was an MP, of course, and a minister, and is now senior fellow at the Jackson Institute, Yale University. Joins us from the US. Welcome, Rory.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So the first question, before we get on to Afghanistan, I just had a question about the situation over here at the moment with MPs. You'll have seen from the other side of the Atlantic what's happening. The inquiry into Owen Paterson, furious Commons debates, lots of demands for change and reform. You were an MP and then you left. What do you make of it? I mean, the Brits say they want better politicians. Is that possible? How do they get them?
I think one of the things, I mean, there are many things that are pretty dismal about this, and I don't want to come across as some pompous ex-MP making moral judgments, but at the heart of it is problems with our constitution, with the rules and respecting the rules. So, what was going wrong last week? It wasn't just that Owen Paterson had been found guilty by a committee, but it was that Parliament was somehow trying to overturn that committee. So there doesn't seem to be any real sense in Parliament about what it can and can't do. And that's particularly worrying because what you end up with is a weird world in which the Prime Minister and the whips are forcing people to do bizarre things. That's included, going back in time, things like the prorogation of Parliament, dissolving Parliament to try to get a particular vision of Brexit through in 2019. And I find all this really troubling because if you think about those MPs, most of them would not have wanted probably to vote to abolish that committee. But there's a horrible kind of tribal pressure. People feel awkward about disagreeing with each other. They're forced to do things that make them probably feel a bit sick. And it's this horrible sort of sense of fake loyalty. In other words, the great word loyalty being used to force people to do things that they feel queasy about. And I think somewhere also at the bottom of it, something that makes me very sad, which is presumably some of these people are beginning to think, did we really sign up for this man to be Prime Minister? He's increasingly doing things which we disapprove of and we don't feel proud of, and we're not happy facing our constituency, but we're loyally tromping through the lobbies doing that. And what's the solution to this? I think the solution has to be rediscovering a sense of some sort of values. We need, in a very simple way, people to say, no, that's not how we do things. We're not going to behave in this way.
You think that is there something structurally wrong with the parties? Because of course the parties are the gatekeepers, the two major parties thinking of principally in terms of control over selection. So they're the filter through which people pass. I've been thinking a lot about this recently. I would have, until fairly recently, taken a very traditionalist view, which was that people should go into politics at a relatively early age. Most of the greats started out very young, actually, and took the view that it would take them a while to get to cabinet. They might get fired along the way. They'd go through 2 or 3 iterations and then be ready to be foreign secretary or prime minister. You think of Pitt, Pitt the Younger. Obviously, you think of Disraeli, Gladstone, Lloyd George, Churchill, Thatcher. These are all people who went into politics relatively young. So that's how I saw it, and thought that the benefit of that was that it was a training ground. At moments of crisis, gave you the possibility of greatness appearing. I'm not so sure that that's true anymore in terms of how life works, the number of career changes people have. You've done it yourself, and I'm starting to think maybe people need to do other things and maybe hop in and out of politics. Maybe do it for 10 years or do it right at the end of a career when they don't need the money. They may have earned their money in law or one of the professional services. What do you think?
Well, I think that it's a very interesting question. A lot of things to unpack there. One of them is that one of the strange things about Britain is that, like you, I and many other people tend to imagine there's a whole continuum going all the way back to Pitt the Younger. But of course, the truth is that all those people that you talked about, except for Mrs. Thatcher, really came in 18th, 19th century politics. They were wealthy people with private incomes. And yes, they came in young, but they didn't come in by stuffing envelopes and campaigning on streets. They weren't hardworking local councillors. They weren't special advisors. They didn't go through the whole strange mill, which is really designed as a sort of hazing ritual now since the 1950s. Getting into politics has been a sort of hazing ritual where you have to humiliate yourself for 5, 10, 15 years, standing in unwinnable seats, endlessly campaigning on local councils. And it creates a particular type of personality because what it prioritizes above all is loyalty, your ability to really take the crap, be humiliated again and again and again, month in, month out. I mean, the reason why presumably you didn't become a member of parliament, many other people don't become a member of parliament, because they simply don't have the stamina to give up 10 years of their life generally before they can ever enter parliament, spending every weekend and every evening out there delivering those leaflets and making friends with the 200-300 members of their local constituency association, mostly elderly, to do. And that produces a very odd sort of person. What it means is that by the time they enter parliament, most of their idealism has already been knocked out of them. Right? Most of their vision of public service has gone. They've been trained to see it as about loyalty and about a war with another political party, because that's what you're really doing with delivering those leaflets and campaigning. So we select people who are great street campaigners, and then we expect them to be great cabinet ministers. And it doesn't really work because the mindset of the great street campaigner is not really about critical thinking. It's not really about reading widely. It's not really about thinking boldly. It's about loyalty and party political games. So most of the cabinet are surprisingly cynical. I mean, I feel this coming from the United States. I'm talking to the United States. American politicians are oddly, feel to me at least, much more idealistic now than British politicians. Genuinely much more interested in ideas. They may not be formally as bright. They may not have gone to the best schools, the best universities, but there is a culture of really caring. You know, I talk to the local congressperson here and they want to spend 2 hours talking about the details of what's happening in Afghanistan. That's very rare now in British politics. British politics for years now, it's been a sort of game where people calculate, it's not worth 2 hours of my time worrying about the details of what's happening in Afghanistan. What do the opinion polls tell me? Is that going to get votes? How's that going to harm the opposition? Forget it. I'll have a line, you know, we're going to support the troops or we're going to do what we can to get refugees. I don't want to know the details of that stuff. And that goes to the depths of everything. I felt in the tea rooms, almost impossible. You would have found this, you deal with politicians, quite difficult to have an earnest policy conversation because the tone is very, very sort of light-hearted, very sort of cynical. It's gossipy. It's not a serious culture. We don't really ask ourselves, is this person fit to be the Secretary of State in this particular department? It's a game of a promotion.
So, quick question, just before we go on to Afghanistan. I mean, would you ever go back? You're in the US now, but would you ever go back into full-time UK politics?
Well, I think about it all the time. I mean, I thought about possibly standing in Owen Patterson's seat as an independent, but it is such a strange world, such a strange culture. I mean, it's very, very difficult to communicate to somebody who's not in it how depressing it is day in, day out, unless you really love the sort of daily game of jeering in the House of Commons and who's up and who's down. It's a much more depressing career than any other thing I've seen, compared to the army or the foreign office or academia or journalism, where you're generally surrounded by people who have a sense of common culture, common values, common loyalty, and who don't treat things as though it's a game. Too many people in politics, sadly, don't want to have serious, responsible conversations. They want to. It's a depressing culture, and I would have been so depressed being asked on a 3-line whip last week to vote for Owen Patterson. Not vote for Owen Patterson, vote to abolish a parliamentary committee. I mean, it's unimaginably depressing because either you are loyal to your party, in which case you feel bad about yourself, or you try to retain your integrity, in which case you've blown up all your relationships with your colleagues. I mean, it's a really toxic environment. So the answer is yes, I'm often tempted, but the truth is I'm also very, very aware after 10 years in politics, just what a very strange and miserable world it is.
Speaking of serious and responsible conversations, let's talk about Afghanistan. Now, describe to us what's the situation now on the ground? You're in the US, but you've obviously got a lot of links there. You know it well. What is the situation on the ground?
Well, it's horrible. I mean, I was in Afghanistan the end of last year, and it was already pretty bad then. COVID had struck Afghanistan very hard, but since then it's got much worse. Obviously, the Taliban has taken over, which is horrifying in terms of, to put it in grand terms, political and civil rights. But basically, if you are somebody who's been a critic of the Taliban, if you are from the Shia minority in central Afghanistan, in many ways, if you're a woman, right, life has got much worse. But also there's a drought. And compounding that, Britain, the United States, Europe have essentially suspended almost all their development and humanitarian aid. They've announced big numbers. So the British government's announced well over £200 million. But there's no serious plan on how to deploy that money. That money isn't being spent. What you've got is Afghans who are now very short of food and will soon be starving to death. Some are already starving to death. A lot of nonprofits and charities on the ground and UN agencies who have staff who could be doing things who are simply not receiving the support to do them. Because for some good reasons and some bad reasons, the international community has basically turned its back on Afghanistan.
And what needs to happen now, do you think?
Well, essentially, we need to understand that starving the Afghan people, or threatening to starve the Afghan people in the belief that that's somehow going to change the behavior of the Taliban, is cruel, it's immoral, and it's completely unworkable. We know this. We know this from the generals in Myanmar. We know this from the guys that run South Sudan, that threatening to starve populations doesn't change the behavior of governments. All it does is lead to untold misery. There is definitely a way of getting support through the Afghan people without giving it to the Taliban government. That's what these UN agencies and charities exist to do. I run a small charity on the ground. There are much bigger charities like Save the Children who can do this stuff. Right? We're all ready to do things, but we're tied up. We're tied up in crazy bureaucratic rules. We're tied up in silly anxieties around legal requirements. So, for example, there are 1 million Afghan women who work in the carpet industry. We could be selling their carpets around the world, but nobody feels confident doing that because we aren't confident on legal advice on paying export tax. And that's just a tiny example, but you can repeat it 100 times over.
And how should we think about the Taliban now? I mean, this is really, really difficult in the West, isn't it? Considering the amount of sacrifice, worse for the Afghans, but the sacrifices that were made by the Western powers, lives lost, and the Taliban was, of course, the enemy. The intervention in 2001 was designed to remove the Taliban. They're now in power. Do you advocate do you just have to be, does the West just have to be completely pragmatic about that and forget it?
Well, I think there are two things. I mean, the first is we need to honor 20 years of relationships between ourselves and Afghans. Nearly 2 million Americans, Brits, and others served in Afghanistan in different capacities over that 20-year period. We have friendships, we have relationships, and there are 37 million people living in Afghanistan. They didn't vote for the Taliban. In many ways, we abandoned them to the Taliban. One of the reasons the Afghan army collapsed so quickly is essentially we dismantled their entire air force as the Taliban was advancing and did nothing really to support them.
And that was by removing technical support and know-how on computers.
Exactly. Essentially, they couldn't get those planes off the ground because they depended. It's a completely crazy idea. We designed an air force that required 18,000 foreign civilian contractors to operate those planes, and we took those contractors out. So they couldn't get the software updates, they couldn't fly. And so you had little platoons of Afghan soldiers who were getting no resupply. They couldn't get their ammunition, they couldn't get their food, they couldn't get their medical evacuation. So they had fought very bravely against the Taliban for nearly 20 years, but ultimately their morale broke. And the thing that broke it was the sense that there was no one holding their back, and in particular that they were going to have no escort. So we bear some responsibility for this. But above all, we must understand that it isn't that the Afghan people somehow chose the Taliban. Right? I'm getting people saying, well, we can't give them any money. If the Afghan people chose the Taliban, it's up to them. They're on their own. But they didn't choose the Taliban. If you're a female teacher in Kabul, you are horrified by what's happened. You want to leave the country. Right? You're on the edge of starvation, and this brutal government's taken over. So we need to separate, obviously, this government, which has taken power by force, largely, or to a very large extent, because of what we did, from the interests of the Afghan people. And we need to honor our relationship with the Afghan people, and we need to do what we can to support them. And remember that, put it in context, we do that for many people around the world. I don't mean Britain alone. I mean the international community does it for people in a humanitarian crisis in sub-Saharan Africa as well.
Now, where's China in all of this? Because, of course, China is now, as once the West vacated the scene, the Americans left, and into that vacuum, China, which obviously has security interests in the area and a particular relationship with Pakistan. China's there. What's it trying to achieve? And I mean, China's not a country which necessarily likes being on the spot in that way and being responsible in the way that the Americans do or did take responsibility.
And you're completely right. China does not want to nation build in Afghanistan. They don't want to carry the development weight of Afghanistan. The world is a very odd place. And one of the odd things about it is that essentially when we talk about the international community, we really mean America, Europe, Canada, Australia. Countries like China are getting wealthier and wealthier, but they are not international players in that way. And they're not going to be. And people are quite right to say it seems a bit unjust that these wealthy countries are not carrying their weight, but they don't want to and they're not going to. We have a choice between either a disaster, starvation, horror, with the Chinese playing potentially some developing political relationships with the Taliban government, but they're not going to step in and support the state because that's not how they do things. And so if we wish people to avoid starvation, we have reasons to do that because we don't want more instability, more terrorism, more horror in Afghanistan. It is for countries like Britain and Europe and the United States to step in, as it has been really since the Second World War. But the sad thing is that we're losing confidence, we're losing energy. And one of the signs that we're losing confidence and energy as, in inverted commas, the West, is that we're increasingly inclined to say, well, why aren't the Chinese doing more? Why aren't the Pakistanis doing more? Why aren't the Indians doing more? Well, a good question, but that's the way the world is. And either we want to stand up for our values, which include looking after people in horror, in poverty, but also, I would say, stand up for values which include democracy. I'd like to see Britain lead a coalition trying to get democratic states to step up, for example, and take a fair burden share of Afghan refugees.
So you have just preempted my last question, but I was going to ask you, what are the longer term risks of this going wrong? Firstly, in humanitarian terms, and then secondly, in terms of security, the security sphere.
So, in absolutely straightforward terms, as Afghanistan collapses into becoming one of the poorest countries on earth, and we'll end up back in the situation that I saw when I walked across Afghanistan 20 years ago. I walked across Afghanistan just the end of the Taliban period, and 1 in 5 children were dying before the age of 5. Adult life expectancy was about 37, and there was just no services across the entire country. It literally, in central Afghanistan, very, very difficult to see any difference between a village in central Afghanistan in 2001 and what it would have been like in the early Middle Ages. Right? No electricity, no healthcare, no government, nothing. Right? And we're about to go back to that. And what does that mean? That means that there will be instability, there will be starvation, there will be many, many Afghans trying to leave the country as migrants or refugees. And the Taliban government will struggle to hold control. ISIS, Khorasan, which is already set off 54 bomb attacks in the last few weeks in Afghanistan alone, will start mounting more and more terrorist attacks in Afghanistan and out of Afghanistan. ISIS is an international jihadi group. Instability will spread to places like Pakistan. So that's a dangerous situation. But there's a bigger story, which is about the West, about liberal values, about democracy, about things that I care about, you care about, and the world used to care about. And one of the strange things about the way in which President Biden has responded to this is he seems to have forgotten that part of the picture. Afghanistan, for all its troubles, and many troubles, it was corrupt, it was fragile, but it was a democratically elected government. And it is now run by an unelected, brutal, jihadi theocracy. And we need to think more positively about how Afghanistan in 15, 20 years' time could be slightly more prosperous, slightly more democratic, slightly more pro-West than it is today. But our only path to get there is to provide generous humanitarian development support, not to the Taliban government, but to the Afghan people, because we don't do that. If we betray them at this moment, we guarantee all our nightmares will happen.
Rory Stewart, thank you very much for joining us. If you're not a subscriber to Reaction on YouTube, you just hit the subscribe button. Also visit the address below. You can become a member of Reaction. You get my weekly newsletter on politics and lots more from the Reaction team. Until next time, thank you for listening and watching, and thank you very much, Rory Stewart.
Thank you. Bye-bye.